This is Duke University.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. This is a great crowd, and I'm glad we're able to squeeze in some extra chairs, and we've got people up 3 levels, so it's very exciting to see such a great crowd. I am Bill Adair. I am the Knight Professor for the Practice of Journalism and Public Policy here at Sanford, and it is just a great honor to be here at the 21st John Fisher Zeidman Memorial Colloquium on Politics and the Press. I want to first thank the Zeidmans who are here, Phil and Nancy Zeidman and Jennifer. It's just great to have your support for this. It's a wonderful program, and we're really thrilled to have this as a regular feature here at Sanford. And thank you so much. Phil, would you like to? This is the 21st Zeidman Colloquium, and if you look at some of the past participants, we've had some real stars of the media discussing the election results, and likewise, we have a great panel with us today. The event is dedicated to the memory of a Duke student, John Fisher Zeidman, who was in the class of 1983, who developed a great interest in politics and the press while studying at Duke. He recognized as a young man just how essential the media is in the political landscape of our country. All of us here are beneficiaries of the Zeidman family, whose expression of love for their son made this important conversation about politics and the press possible. So again, we thank you. So today we're going to be talking about politics and the media, something we probably all do a lot. Our goal today is to go a little deeper and talk not just about the 2014 election, but to talk particularly about how it was covered and how it was not covered this time. I'm sure many of you have seen good post-game analysis of the election. We'll do some of that today. But our main focus is to look a little deeper and talk about how the media did. Specifically, we want to explore what was new in the campaign coverage this year, what changed in the campaign coverage this year, and what the lessons are for democracy. This event is put on by the DeWitt Wallace Center for Media and Democracy, and it reflects that the media has a really important role to empower democracy. I think we'll see in some ways, as we discuss things today, that the media is doing some very new and important things in covering elections and empowering democracy. I think in other ways, as legacy news organizations have cut their staffs, there are fewer eyeballs keeping watch on the candidates and on government. And I find that worrisome, and I worry about holding power accountable in this new media age. And so we'll be talking today about what our panelists saw in their campaign coverage and how things have changed. We have an all-star panel today. To my left is Nate Silver. Nate is the founder and editor of FiveThirtyEight, a website that has really pioneered a new form of political reporting. Nate was, as you probably know, an early statistician. When his parents dropped him off at preschool once, he declared, "Today I'm a numbers machine," and proceeded to count to 2,123. He graduated from the University of He graduated from the University of Chicago and became a baseball statistician. In 2007, he became frustrated with the polls and how they were being presented, and began blogging for Daily Kos under the pseudonym Poblano. What was Poblano? Why?
It's a chili pepper. It's a long story. I'm obsessed with my stuff.
In fact, to lure Nate here, I had to guarantee him unlimited burritos. Nate then founded FiveThirtyEight, which became a must-read in 2008 for its creative approach of the presidential race. FiveThirtyEight was so successful it moved first to the New York Times and most recently to ESPN, where it relaunched last March and where they're doing some really interesting, creative data journalism. So it is great to have you here. To my far right is Brian Stelter, one of the innovative young talents in journalism. Brian started TV Newser while a college student. TV Newser is a blog that even when Brian was a student at Towson University, was breaking news about the TV business, and I think a real sign of his eye for new media and his incredible creativity and energy. Brian Williams from NBC News called TV Newser the closest thing to the Bible on the TV news industry. So I guess in a way you have authored the Bible. Brian sold TV Newser to Media Bistro and became a reporter for the New York Times right out of college. If you've seen the movie Page One, which is about the New York Times, you know how Brian is an energetic reporter who digs and is always on top of the latest news about news. And he is just relentless in looking for scoops. He recently left the New York Times and joined CNN, where he has brought some new energy to the show Reliable Sources, which is on Sunday mornings. And you can also read his online...
Sunday at 11. That in there.
And you know what? You've also put it online, which is great. It's great to be able to see the segments the next day or later Sunday. So that's been...
You want to know a fun fact about me and Nate?
Yeah.
I wrote the news story about Nate joining the New York Times, and then I wrote the story about him leaving the New York Times. Very sad when I had to write that one. But then I left a couple months later, so it wasn't so sad.
And lately you've been writing for CNN Money. Is that the main home for your online reporting?
Yep.
And then to my immediate right is Molly Ball. Molly is a talented writer who covers national politics for The Atlantic. She joined The Atlantic from Politico, where she covered the 2010 midterm elections and the 2012 primaries. She is a graduate of Yale and was a 2009 Knight Wallace Fellow at the University of Michigan. She won this is when I first was introduced to you, you won the 2012 Robin Toner Prize for Excellence in Political Reporting. She's also won the Sandy Hume Award for Political Reporting and from the National Press Club and the Lee Walchuk Award for Political Analysis in 2013. One of the big reasons we wanted to have Molly is her incredibly keen eye for detail. Reading some of her coverage of the campaign, it's just rich with detail about people who are out on the campaign trail, people who are not on the campaign trail, and she practices what I'm afraid is a shrinking art in journalism, which is the practice of going places and interviewing people, and she does it extremely well with great creativity and a really fresh eye. So it is great to have you here. So we're going to start off with short presentations from each of our panelists, and then we will have a discussion, and then we'll open it up for questions from you. So with that, we're going to start with Nate.
Okay, is this mic working? Oh yeah, apparently. So I'm going to be rude and pull out my phone because I wrote some notes to myself. Don't do this if you're in class and you get called on.
We don't let the students use their phones in class.
It would drive me crazy if I were a professor. But I'm going to start by talking about a little bit about the polling. Polling is a part of media coverage. I think sometimes people forget that. It's fairly expensive to do high-quality polling. In fact, it's getting more expensive because you have to contact more people to get the same number of responses. People often have better things to do than to answer a 15-minute survey. But one reason why, if you had asked the New York Times, why do you do polling? Why do you keep this polling budget at a time when you're cutting staff elsewhere? They would say that this is a way to represent the voice of the people as a check, actually, against misreporting from the press. That the press could say, oh, voters in Arkansas really care about Obamacare. They probably did in that case, but if you found a poll that found they didn't actually do it, then that's usually wisdom that should be more valued than the reporter's take on what public sentiment might be. And of course, the polls are easier on some things than others. The horse race question, who are you going to vote for, has historically been probably the easiest question that pollsters ask. It's an unambiguous question, more so than looking at other types of issues. But still, the polls are by no means perfect, and this year served as a demonstration of that. So the polls and the forecasting sites like FiveThirtyEight were correct in saying that it was going to be a good year for Republicans. But Republicans won a couple of states, including North Carolina, actually, where they narrowly trailed in the polls. There were also a couple of other states where there were bigger messes. In Virginia, the Democrat Mark Warner won, but by only a point or so. He'd been up by 10 points in the polls. In the Maryland governor's race, no one bothered to poll the race in the last 3 weeks of the campaign, no public pollster. And during that time, the Republican had moved from being 10 points back to winning by 5 points. The most important theme for us, and I think we can give ourselves credit for a reason I'll explain in a moment, was that the error in polls was correlated from state to state. It wasn't like you had a miss toward Democrats in one state and Republicans in the other. In almost every state where there was an error, Republicans did better than the polling anticipated they would do. In the Senate, it didn't have that much impact. Looks like they'll win 54 seats. If they win Louisiana, we had 53 as being the most likely number. But there were, I think, 4 governor's races that they won despite being behind in the polls. A couple of Senate races, North Carolina and Kansas, depending on which poll you look at. A couple other near messes, and they all went in the same direction. This is important because it demonstrates that it's actually not just as simple as looking at the polling average. This has happened, by the way, on several cases in the past. In 1994, a big Republican wave year, well, that became apparent on Election Day. It wasn't as clear based on the pre-election polling. In 1998, Democrats did unusually well for the president's party at a midterm election. They actually gained seats in the House, I think, and the polling did not anticipate that very well either. 2006, Democratic wave year, again, underestimated in most states by the polls. This has been a pretty common pattern. And when we talked about, so throughout the campaign, you had a lot of Democrats complaining, oh, the polls are biased against Democrats. They said they were biased in 2012 against Democrats. They said, well, they're not accounting for minority turnout and how the demographics of the country are changing. They said they're not accounting for early voters or for our turnout program that worked so well in 2012. And in fact, as I said, the polls were biased, but they had a skew toward Democrats instead. And this kind of paralleled what happened in 2012, where Republicans spent a great deal of time and effort claiming the polls would be biased against them, and in fact, Obama outperformed his polls in almost every swing state. He did win the states that the polls called him to win on, but he won a lot of states by 6 or 7 points when he won by 1 or 2, when he was ahead by just 1 or 2 points in the polls instead, like in Colorado, for example. That still counts as an error, potentially. It's not just about calling the states right that reduces the problem, a complex problem, to a simple one. It's about how close was the polling in a particular state. Virginia called the right winner was a pretty bad miss for the polls. The other disturbing thing we found out about the polls this year is that there was something called herding going on, H-E-R-D-I-N-G. Herding is the term we use to describe when the pollsters are no longer behaving independently and instead are conscious of what other polls are saying and want to remain within that consensus. So one of the more interesting cases was the Iowa Senate race, where most polls had the Democrat Bruce Braley trailing, the Republican Joni Ernst ahead, but by a narrow margin, by a point or two. And almost every poll that came out in the last week of the campaign had the same number: Ernst +1, Ernst +2, tie, Ernst +3, Braley +1 sometimes, except for Ann Stelter, who runs the poll for the Des Moines Register, the Iowa poll, and she had Ernst up by 7. That proved to be an extremely accurate poll. Ernst won by 8.5 points in fact. She has a history of trusting what her data tells her. Somewhat famously, in 2008, she issued a poll on New Year's Day. I remember being at a New Year's party and having to wait for this stupid poll from the Iowa Des Moines Register that had Obama winning the Iowa caucus by 7 or 8 points over Hillary Clinton, and that's exactly what Obama did. But she is someone who has the guts to actually trust what the data tells her. A lot of pollsters will censor polls. We found out after the fact that in Virginia, for example, there were at least 2 polls in the campaign that showed a really tight race there that did not publish their results because they thought it would get pilloried for having published an outlier. That's really bad. It might be a smart strategy for the pollsters individually, but it means we learned less from them collectively because there's no longer as much independence. And I wonder if that's a metaphor sort of for some of the problems with campaign coverage today and journalism today in many fields today, not just journalism, where there are so many outlets now, and I guess it becomes easier now to diagnose what you're doing. You can run traffic statistics in real time and detect second by second how many people are viewing exactly which page on the website. I'm sure the demographics in television are just as comprehensive. Well, maybe that leads to herding of coverage where people gravitate toward a story and sometimes it's the wrong story. You certainly saw in 2012 how there were points in the campaign when the press insisted that Mitt Romney had momentum, quote unquote, whatever that means, when he didn't really. And just a simple look at the polls would tell you that. This year, frankly, we had less of a disagreement with the conventional wisdom about the race. I think if you had surveyed journalists on election day who's going to win, how certain is it? They probably say, oh yeah, 75% Republican, which is where we had the forecast with our algorithm. So we didn't have that fun element of conflict with the press this year. But still, it was an interesting year for us. We relaunched FiveThirtyEight under the auspices of ESPN. That meant from having a staff of effectively 3 or 4 people at the New York Times to about 20 people over there. And we're going to be advertising for some new positions soon. So if you know people who are looking for jobs, we'll be doing that. But you also had a lot of other sites that were putting more emphasis on data-driven coverage. The place that I left, the New York Times, began a product called The Upshot, which I think they see as a potential competitor of FiveThirtyEight. It's not quite the same, but certainly more coverage. It's flavored in data and statistics. The Washington Post recently bought the blog The Monkey Cage, which was political scientists writing about politics in real time. So I think it's good. It's good for me to see this, and I like a lot of that coverage. Sometimes people say, "Well, is there too much of this all of a sudden? Is there a bubble in this?" And my view is, no, certainly not. I don't think that the type of coverage that we provide ought to be the only way to cover news. I think it probably ought not to be the majority of it. But I think it should have a reasonably big place at the table. There are a lot of things you can cover apart from politics with a more data-driven approach. And maybe now it's gone from being, 1% of the news hole to 5% or something. I know our traffic has scaled up pretty well relative to the New York Times. We're publishing about 5 times as many articles as we did, and traffic is about 5 times as high. So that suggests to me that we are not at the point of diminishing returns yet as far as people's appetite for this type of coverage. One of the challenges we do face is that you maybe don't have reporters who are trained in math and statistics. At the same time, the journalistic background is really valuable. You still have to know how to write. You still have to know how to communicate. Remember that you're communicating to an audience. A lot of journalism is guilty sometimes of journalism for journalists' sake, and that's not what you can do if you want to have even any modicum of commercial success. So we definitely appreciate people's training and news judgment. At the same time, we're working with a staff that's pretty young and is all kind of new at their current job, even if they had a job in journalism before. So it's been, a lot of fun learning with them over the course of the 8 months that we've been present with ESPN. Also, you spend a lot of time putting out fires in the first couple of months. You're basically you don't really know anything about running a website until you actually start publishing anything. You can whiteboard concepts as much as you want and talk as much theory as you want until you're actually publishing a site for an audience in the act of journalism, then you're dumb as hell, really. And now we have 8 months of experience under our belt, learning how we react to stories in the news, learning what our readers like and don't like and what expectations they have of us, and just getting better as a team. So it's been a lot of fun, but also a lot of work. I am looking forward to next year being an odd-numbered year where we can actually sleep a little bit.
Thank you. All right, now we'll hear from Brian Stelter.
And I have some notes on my phone as well, and I would start by, I want to go back to the point you just made about trending, about topics trending, and about hurting of coverage as a result. Because this midterm election, you could argue, was never trending. You could argue it was never a quote-unquote trending topic. And that may explain the differences in some of the coverage between this year and 2012, but certainly 2010, 2006, prior midterm cycles. But I want to go back to that in a minute. I want to start by saying something very positive. You're describing some of the flaws in the polling and in some of the results of sites like yours as a result, because the polls were, we won't say slanted in favor of the Democrats. What word do we use?
Well, people say skewed, because there was a skewed poll site that people have adapted
Unskewed,
now.
right. But I would say this, and this is a more positive thought, there were no big mistakes this year. There were no, from my point of view as a media reporter who has to write the stories about stupid journalistic malfeasance and malfunctions and error, there was no giant, egg on the face, eat your shoe sort of moment. There were some polling results that were off, and there are lots of reasons for that Nate was describing. But in terms of the calling a state wrong and having to retract it, in terms of an interview that goes off the radio, in terms of those sorts of classic journalistic mistakes, none of those really reached the point of mass attention this year, which I think is worth pointing out. It's sort of a good sign when there's nothing horribly wrong in the coverage on election night or in the months leading up. Now, you could argue that not seeing Eric Cantor's loss coming was the closest to that. That was sort of a collective moment of journalists asking themselves, why did we not see this coming? Why was this not on our radar? But that was so early in the cycle that it's something that maybe it's the closest thing to it. So I want to go back to that idea, though, of trending, or of the story not trending, because one of the most interesting threads to me, and I'll identify a few threads that then we can talk about later, one of the most interesting threads this year for me as a media reporter with a weekly show on a channel that loves politics was that there was not a lot of appetite for stories about the election, for stories about politics. And there are lots and lots of reasons for that we can get into. And one of the reasons that was advanced by the Media Research Center, a conservative media watchdog group, was that the liberal media was covering up the election, was blacking out the election in order to disadvantage Republicans, in order to disadvantage conservatives. And there's a liberal media bias, they might even say liberal media conspiracy, to not cover the elections as much as they did, the press did in 2010, 2006. Now, when you say things like that, you're usually referring mostly to television news coverage, and you're mostly referring to national news media coverage, because obviously it's much harder to track and document local coverage and newspaper coverage and digital coverage. But MRC did a really interesting study where they looked at September and October, actually back into the summer as well, and found almost no coverage of the midterms on the nightly network evening newscasts. They found that ABC's World News Tonight hadn't mentioned the midterms at all for a couple of months, right up until the end of October. And then a couple of days after the study came out, ABC's World News Tonight started to cover the midterms, which I'm sure is a coincidence. So they accused the World News Tonight and these other newscasts, which had been covering the midterms, some but not much, of dramatic bias. Because if you compare the amount of coverage in 2010, and especially more importantly at 2006, you could see there was so many more stories in 2006 on the nightly news about the midterms, where we were seeing a Democratic wave, than in 2014. What I thought the study missed, and what I think is illuminating, is that the changes in the news media landscape are happening so stunningly quickly that it's almost impossible to compare 2006 to 2014. Very hard also to compare 2010 to 2014. And when we're talking about politics in the press as we are this afternoon, I think we have to keep that in mind throughout the conversation, that ABC's World News Tonight is not the same product it was 8 years ago or 4 years ago. CNN is not the same product it was 8 or 4 years ago. Fox News is not the same product it was 4 or 8 years ago. And I bring that up because I think oftentimes cries of bias are about something else. It's about bias toward conflict or bias toward sensationalism or other buckets that are actually more interesting to discuss than left-right bias. But I do think MRC was onto something. They were onto something. There was a dramatic decline in the number of those stories on those nightly newscasts. And anecdotally, just perceptually as a viewer of television, I noticed it as well on CNN, the channel where I work, and to some extent in local television as well. I think partly we attribute that to the fact, as I was saying, it was never trending. The midterms as a thing never became the dominant news story, at least from maybe you all would disagree, the dominant news story in the United States of America. What did? Well, ISIS did, right? The threat posed by ISIS or not. And the threat posed by Ebola or not. And I think the ways in which ISIS and Ebola interacted with the midterm news, with the political news cycle are, I mean, my gosh, I wish I were a professor who could study that for the next 2 years. You know, the findings that will come down the road about how Ebola affected this election, how the hysteria, the ridiculous and embarrassing hysteria, and I was part of it, how it affected the election is, you know, you know. You look at the polls a month ago, 2/3 of Americans were thought that Ebola could affect their family personally, and that was trending, right? And the election was not. I think there's something there, and I think there's something there about media and democracy that we got to think about. I would just say that the other difference between 2006 and 2010, and now, of course, is what you were touching on, Nate, about all these sites, all of these new destinations, whether it's a 538 or it's a Vox. We can go down the list, and we've got to include BuzzFeed on that list, even though there's still a stereotype of the cat videos that is so long gone now. You know, BuzzFeed was breaking stories about the election in the same way the Atlantic and the New York Times and CNN all were. I don't know if we're at the point yet where the internet is now the primary source of news for Americans, but I'm pretty sure we're there for politics, for political news. I'm pretty sure we're already there. That's now the primary source, the dominant source. Doesn't mean television goes away. It just means that television becomes the number 2. And it means that television video is part of the internet, of course. So the CNNs of the world play an important role there. But sure feels to me like we're now past that point. And when you don't see World News Tonight or CNN covering midterms as much or covering elections as much, it's partly because it's all online. And it's partly because the internet's a better, more effective medium for a lot of that content. That's just a kind of assertion we could debate or disagree about. And I would say one more point to make as we start, and that's about the commercials. That's about the ads. I think we got to think about that when we think about media, not just the journalism, but also the horrific campaign ads. It just seems to get worse. And we say that from the point of view of a viewer, because I'm sure if you're a candidate, you feel it's getting better. Because you're able to saturate the consumer more than ever. But from the perspective of a consumer, from a viewer, from a citizen, from the perspective of anyone who wants to be informed in a democracy and not yelled at or threatened or terrified by campaign ads, it just keeps getting worse. And so I put that on the table as we start because I wish there had been more conversations about that piece of this when it relates to the media in this midterm cycle. I tried to do it on my program the Sunday before the elections. I brought on an ad maker and I brought on a local TV station manager. And the manager of the station in Iowa said to me, what was different this year, it wasn't necessarily the volume. There were still just as many ads in October as there were in 2012. The difference was how early it started this year. That it was in July and in August and in September that the ads were overwhelming even then, even earlier on. And of course, he predicted that they'll just start earlier and earlier in 2016 and in 2018. I don't know how blunt I can be about this, but it's not good for the country, is it? It can't possibly be good for these ads, for these lies, for these negative ads to be dominating our local television screens without all of the profits from those ads then being reinvested into local news coverage. I mean, that's where I get into it, interestingly, as a media reporter. put all the ads on TV you want. But then let's take some more of those profits and hire more reporters to do more reporting and more fact-checking of the ads. It made me really bummed out when I was in Arizona. I was talking to a local television reporter, a political reporter there, and I said to her, so how many millions of dollars do you think from all these ads have been reinvested in your newsroom? And she laughed at me. And the proper response should not be laughter at that idea. The proper response should be a discussion about what's appropriate and what's not. Because as you said, Bill, in your introduction, we have seen significant cutbacks in reporting muscle in politics and in general reporting as well. We've been seeing it for years, and it seems to be continuing in certain parts of the media industry. I think it's just worth putting out on the table the idea that there are media companies that benefit tremendously from these elections through the advertising purchases from campaigns, but we're not seeing that necessarily returned back to the news content. So with that speech, with that diatribe, I'll pause there and hear your questions later.
All right, Molly Ball.
Just to underscore the metaphor here, as the traditional reporter on the panel, I've brought a notebook rather than reading off of my phone.
Wait, but your phone was ringing just now. Was that your phone?
It was. Sorry about that. Must be breaking news. So we've all been circling around this question of why were we surprised as a political media by what happened in this election? Was it because of some sort of systematic bias in the media coverage of the election? Why did we fail to see coming the scope of the Republican wave that happened earlier this month? I would say first of all, it's okay to be surprised. That's why we have news, because things happened that we weren't anticipating. That's the definition of news, and that's okay. I know that people think that we have made a factual error when we fail to predict the future, but that's not true. The future is unknowable, and that's why we do this. I don't make predictions as a matter of personal policy when I'm punditizing on television or whatever else, because I feel like if you think you know what's going to happen, why cover the news? Why not take a 6-month nap? You already know. Nothing can happen that can upset your model, right? And this is not, I'm not razzing Nate here, because I do think that he's contributed in really amazing ways to refining the ways that we try to predict what happens. But it is okay to be surprised. I think that's the fun part of this job. But then there has been, I have heard from a lot of conservatives since the election, well, this was media bias. You didn't tell us what you knew was going to happen. You didn't tell us that Republicans were about to do well because you didn't want us to know, or you wanted to, or you didn't want it to happen, et cetera, et cetera. Well, if that were the case, Republicans would not have been so surprised. Every Republican I know was surprised they won the Maryland governor's race, including, I think, that candidate. I don't think he thought he was going to be the next governor of Maryland if he were really telling the truth. And the pollsters were surprised, and a lot of what we do, as Nate said, to put a check on our gut so we don't get carried away with our impressionistic and anecdotal reporting, is use polling as a backstop to say, okay, a poll is just a bunch of interviews. And I can go to Iowa, and if I'm being really ambitious, I can probably talk to, 50 or 100 voters. But that's not a very good sample. And a poll that is talking to several hundred voters is just going to give me a better, more scientific, and a poll that, is demographically representative, not just the people I ran into at the mall in Des Moines, is going to give me a better idea what the entire Iowa electorate is thinking. So there is this, it's a tough balance to strike. Do we rely too much on polls? There's a lot of complaining that too much of political coverage is about polls, but a poll is just a way of saying, it's a form of humility. It's a form of saying, like, I as a reporter can't talk to 500 people, but I can tell you what 500 people said when our pollster called them on the phone. Now there is, I'd love to hear more of what Nate thinks of this. There is a crisis in the polling industry. The first polls, before we had telephones, people would literally go door to door, and that's still how they do it in some countries. I wonder if we're going to have to go back to that, because these days, people don't have landlines, or they don't answer them. So pollsters have to call more cell phones, and there's different rules on that, and it's more expensive. But people don't talk on their cell phones anymore either. Everyone communicates by texting or by email, or I don't know, some app I don't even know the name of that the kids are using these days. But so pollsters have to adapt to that. Online polling is still a new field that is that a lot of traditional pollsters have a lot of disdain for. Traditional media organizations don't trust it, but I think that's going to be something that's going to continue to be refined, because when you want to talk to a bunch of people who are going to vote, you got to meet them where you are. You got to find them wherever they are hanging out, and they are willing to talk to you. Obviously, they don't want to talk to people on the phone anymore. So this is something that pollsters are continuing to grapple with and to deal with. And I think that that's evolving, and I think that that's something that hasn't been figured out. So I have a lot of compassion for these poor pollsters who we love to beat up on for being incompetent and not seeing it coming and falling down on the job. It's hard. They have a really hard job. They are in a period of flux right now where nobody knows what they're doing. And so that's part of why they're all looking at their neighbors saying, well, he's got this other result. Maybe he knows. I do think also, I think this election broke very late. I think this was an election where the wave that was coming really gained momentum in mid-October. It was, political scientists will tell you that a wave election, usually breaks in September or early October. I think this one was pretty late, and I think it had to do with some of the news stories like ISIS and Ebola that exacerbated some of the sense of insecurity that people were feeling. I love sitting in on focus groups. I love to see what actual people are talking about and making considerations. I also go around and knock on doors and talk to people at the mall in Des Moines to try to use actual real voters as a sounding board and get out of the headspace of just the spin and the consultants and the candidates and all of that. And what you started to see in September was people in these focus groups saying, I don't feel safe. And it was an atmospheric thing, it was a cumulative thing, it was not any one issue, and it was not economic. That is a really interesting thing. The dominant theme of our last several elections has been economic insecurity, as we've had this sort of long tail of the financial crisis. But this was the first election in several cycles where people were saying, I'm doing okay. My husband who got laid off, he got a new job. Or, we're able to, we're keeping our heads above water. We're able to afford our mortgage as we weren't 2 years ago. So the sense of insecurity had a different source. And I do think that if there's something that we missed in the media in failing to predict this election, it was that we misread that national mood. We misread the severity of it. I was on TV a couple weeks before the election saying, well, this isn't like 2010. It's not a mad as hell election. And that was true. This was not a, flaming torches and pitchforks election. This wasn't the Tea Party election like 2010 when the wave really was powered by this overwhelming anger. But there was something equally powerful, which was a sort of sense of discouragement and disappointment, and that was a phenomenon that mostly affected Democrats. It turned out they didn't see reason to vote, and that's just as much of a vote as going out and voting against a candidate when you don't vote. We talk about turnout is down in midterm years. Those people are all still allowed to vote. It's not the weather. This is not a natural phenomenon. They choose not to vote. And what we missed was why all these people were choosing not to vote. You could see it anecdotally. In retrospect, I wish I'd put more emphasis on it, but you did see it anecdotally. I report a lot on the ground game, on the ways campaigns try to mobilize voters, partly because I am obsessed with how things work and seeing things with my own eyes, the way campaigns actually do what campaigns do, which is not just shouting at you from the TV, but which is knocking on your door and trying to pull you out of your house and motivate you to cast a ballot. And so I always go out canvassing with both parties and try and see the state of the art and all of that. And Democrats put a lot of hype into their ground game this year because that was, they said, how they were going to change the dynamic was by changing the traditional midterm electorate. And so there I am in Iowa a couple of weeks before the election, knocking on doors with this woman who's the best canvasser for the Democratic Party in the entire state of Iowa. And we kept knocking on doors and people saying, I don't want to vote this year. I don't like our candidate, or I don't see the point, or I just don't think it's worth it. And you don't want to rely too much on the anecdotal evidence of a single day out canvassing. You don't know who they're targeting. Maybe they're trying to get voters who don't usually vote, and that's why. But I was seeing it all over the place. I was in 10 different states through this year, and I can recall, being in Michigan a couple months before the election, and the Democratic phone bankers saying, I don't think people care about this election. I think that's another thing that we failed to emphasize, that there was a theme to this election. We kept saying, this is an election about nothing, or this is an election that doesn't have a theme. It did have a theme, and the theme was Barack Obama. And that was what the Republicans wanted it to be about, and they succeeded. And I think that there was that was boring, right? Because every campaign was the same. Mitch McConnell's campaign was exactly the same as Tom Tillis's campaign, was exactly the same as Cory Gardner's campaign out in my home state of Colorado. And so there was a tendency to either dismiss it as a Republican talking point or to say, well, that's not news because I've seen it 10 times before and it's really boring. But it was true. And when you talk to voters, they saw this election as a referendum on the president. There were a lot of people, predominantly Republicans, who wanted to go out and cast that vote against Obama, against his agenda. I knew people in Virginia who were saying, I've always voted for Mark Warner. I think he's a good senator, but I want to hold him accountable this year for all of those things he's done with Obama, who I don't like. And so you did have a lot of people casting that accountability vote, and I think we failed to understand the scope of that phenomenon, failed to see how real that was. And so, we talk, whether you're talking about a pollster like Ann Selzer being the best in the business because she trusts her data, or whether you're talking about reporters going out and writing stories, it's important to have independent judgment. It's important to trust your own eyes and ears and write what you really see and not go with the herd. And it's hard, right? It's hard to know when to trust yourself when there's so much countervailing information and spin. When I wrote that article about the Iowa ground game, saying, it was not just based on the day I spent canvassing, it was based on the numbers in the early vote. Democrats were getting slaughtered in the early vote, which is always how they've won elections in Iowa in the past. And so I wrote this story saying, it's becoming mathematically impossible for Democrats to pull off this Senate race in Iowa. I got an email from one of the Democratic press people saying, your article is demonstrably false. It wasn't. Spoiler alert, it was right. What I was seeing, but you have to be strong enough or have enough experience or have enough information coming in to say, no, I know I'm right, and I'm not going to listen to you telling me that I'm wrong. There's a lot of talk about the supposed tension between what Nate does and what I do, between firsthand reporting and database reporting. And I think they're absolutely complementary. I use polls very much to try and figure out what is happening in an election and then go out and figure out why. So you see something bubbling up in the polls. You see that Bruce Braley, the candidate in Iowa, is losing, is behind in the polls. Okay, I can go out and talk to him and see his campaign and find out why he's losing. And it turns out that anybody with 5 senses can see he's a terrible candidate. Or someone like Terry Lynn Land in Michigan, the Republican candidate, who on paper ought to have been able to make that a competitive race. She'd been a statewide elected official. She didn't have a tough primary to get through. And she was up against a pretty generic Democrat in a state that Obama won handily, but that also has tended to elect Republicans in midterms. And again, it was by meeting both of those candidates, speaking to them one-on-one, not relying on the press flax or anything else, but actually witnessing. And you could see, she is not actually a very good candidate at all. And there's a reason that people have decided that she should not be a U.S. senator, that the wise voters of Michigan have made that collective decision. So I think I've talked long enough. I would say I would like to see Brian's data set for this claim that the ads are getting worse. I think political ads have always been terrible. I tend to take the long view, I guess, but from the Daisy ad to the Willie Horton ad to everything else, political ads have always been trying to scare us. I think the difference is actually...
Isn't the volume. There's more airtime now, and they start
But they are reaching
sooner.
fewer people. And that's the thing, is that campaigns have all this money, campaign finance has been deregulated, they don't have anywhere else to spend it, but fewer people are being reached by these ads. Fewer people are watching on television.
Even as they're spending more to buy them.
Even as they're spending more money to buy them. And so there's this, campaigns
you could also
are in
argue
a similar bind.
You could also argue part of the problem is they're having to raise more money and then waste it on TV ads.
Right.
Thus, further corrupting the process. You could argue that's just also
But does it corrupt the process if nobody sees it? Or if it doesn't have any
If
effect?
you have to spend all your time raising money from wealthy people who are then funding that gets into all the dark money issues, the super PAC issues, does it not? And also, I would say local TV is still the main, people still watch 5 hours of TV a day in the United States.
That's the problem, is it reaches more people than anything else, but it still is reaching fewer and fewer people.
Yeah.
And so campaigns are confronting a crisis similar to pollsters, where the audience is moving to places they can't see it. And it's, ironically, we have more information than ever before, but we can't find the voters. So I think that there's a lot of transition happening, not just in the media industry, but in the political industry as well. It's a really interesting time.
Thank you very much. I love that point that we have more information than ever before, but we can't reach the voters. I think that's a great one to.
Via text message in the future. I mean, or something like that. I fantasize about obviously voting with my app on my phone, but maybe before we get to that point, we can at least be polled and things like that, so we improve the polling process.
Yeah, it is kind of amazing how people will trust you now. You can be in an airplane, right, and be on your phone connected to the Wi-Fi in an airplane and transfer however much money you want, $100, $10,000 from your checking account to your savings account, but you still have to stand in line for 3 hours to vote in some parts of the country. It's kind of amazing.
So a lot of really good points in that. So let me follow up on a couple. First, to kind of start broadly, Brian, you made the point that this election was not trending. To a lot of us, it seemed just boring. What do you? So what did we get? What we deserved? I mean, we didn't. There wasn't much interest. There wasn't much of a turnout. And did the bookers and producers make the right call by not putting this content on, or was there a really interesting election out there and it just didn't get covered?
Mm-hmm. I want to hear what Molly thinks, because I think I have. Well, I'll tell you my answer. Let's compare to 2006 again, because to me that's the best analogy currently. 2010, as you were saying, was different. It was about anger. It was a direct rebuttal to 2008's election, but 2006 was also the sixth year of a presidency, and to me, 2006 was a more interesting moment news-wise because it was a more dramatic rebuttal to President Bush than this was to President Obama. Is that a fair thing to say, Molly? That 2006 was a more dramatic response to Bush than this was a dramatic response to Obama?
Well, we knew what 2006 was about. It was about the war. Mm-hmm. Whereas this seemed to be the result, responding to a lot of sort of episodic
generalized
frustration
and anger and fear.
A malaise, if you will. But also, I think there's also a chicken and egg effect, right? Where when people aren't interested in something, we're less likely to cover it. And that's ever more true in the age of the internet. I can see that when I write about the midterms, my stories don't get a lot of traffic compared to what they did in 2012. And so you tend to write about things less when you know that people have less interest in it, and maybe that creates less interest.
It does, and as we're more and more data-driven.
There's this vicious cycle where you get less and less coverage.
Right. I do think we need to put some of that on the press. You're right, because it does. We do drive interest. We drove interest in Ebola. We drove interest in ISIS. We did not drive interest in the election.
Well,
and that might not have been conscious
choices.
No, we are. No, definitely both of them. But I think it's more interesting to think about the ways we are acting as opposed to reacting. Because
oddly, since we cover elections, one of the things we do, whether it's a dull election or whatever else, provide a lot of election coverage. But remember, this year was the first election in a long while where control of government was not at stake, because Republicans, for a variety of reasons, were almost certain to retain control of the House of Representatives. And obviously the House has not cooperated with the White House on very much at all. With the GOP also having the Senate, it may not change those dynamics that much in the near term. It'll matter if there's a Supreme Court nomination. It'll certainly matter down the road. Remember, whichever president gets elected in 2016, Hillary or Elizabeth Warren or Rand Paul or Marco Rubio, they will inherit those senators that were elected earlier this month for their first 4-year term. So there are long-term consequences, but we are coming off a unusually long streak of really dramatic events, political events, right? So think about 2000, which is still kind of a 1 in 1,000 chance that it turned out to be quite that close.
Are you really glad you didn't have FiveThirtyEight back then?
It would have
been a rough year to be running a polling website.
It would have been good for traffic.
That's true.
We had September 11th attacks, of course, and the 2002 elections in the wake of that. We had an extremely close election in 2004. We had a big wave in 2006, where control of government, where Bush did get a major check in power. 2008, of course, was not that close in the end, but certainly historic. 2010, then you did see Democrats lose control of the House. A lot of Obama's ambitions were cut short at that point, never to be restored. We realize now in 2012, another very close election. That's not always been true. If you were running a polling website, it wouldn't be a year like 2000 that I'd worry about. It would be a year like 1984, where Walter Mondale fell to being behind 18.6 points in the 538 average. Today, maybe he'll win Washington, D.C., right? And the same story day after day after day, right? But we've been unusually lucky to have the high volume of political coverage that we had. And believe me, I'm worried about the public's view to our politics. We've had unpopular presidents in this country for a long time. I think it's probably not a great thing for the nation. But still, if you were a voter and you said, which election am I going to sit out? I just need a breather. Then this was probably the right one to sit out. Any election is important. I'd argue that if you're looking at the news value of a story, there should have been more election coverage and not more ISIS coverage. Right. But it was not the sort of existentially important election that you might have had 2 years ago or 4 years ago.
So we talked about you being on the ground, doing reporting, interviewing people. As a consumer of election coverage this time around, here's what I heard a lot of. There's a new ad on the air today from the Tillis campaign. That seemed to me to be the main way that the regional and local media covered the Senate election here. And I don't think I was getting very in-depth coverage if all they're doing is pointing out the latest campaign commercial. And I assume that's a function of there are just fewer reporters covering things. There was, and I haven't seen a number on this, but I'm sure the numbers will back it up. There was less enterprise coverage of the candidates. There was less questioning of the candidates in any significant way by the local media.
Could it be two other factors, though? Could it also be the candidates avoiding interviews and candidates avoiding talking policy? Not to say we can't force them to be interviewed. Well, we can't. Or force them to talk about policy. We can try. But it felt to me like what we, perhaps in this case, the press was covering the ads a lot because they weren't talking policy, right? This wasn't the Obamacare election that it was claimed to be in 2013, right? For example. And it seemed like many of the Republican candidates in particular tried to avoid doing interviews, avoid the press whenever possible.
What did you see, Molly?
I think Brian makes a good point, is that it's not just fewer reporters, it's the candidates exposing themselves to the public less. So a lot of times, if the candidates aren't holding any campaign events, and and what they're spending all their time doing is either dialing for dollars or putting ads on the air, that's what you have to cover. Now, of course, there should be enterprise coverage, there should be investigations, we should be finding other ways to illuminate these candidates beyond just amplifying their message. But it is true that we can't cover things they're not doing.
As sources go direct, which is one of the greatest trends of my media career, meaning sources making YouTube videos, candidates having Twitter accounts, corporations creating their own news-like substances that they're not news. As we see more sources going direct, as we see candidates going around the media directly to the public, it sort of changes the role of the reporters, because we're having to spend more time fact-checking what they are producing for the public because they're not speaking directly to us as much.
So Molly spoke about the crisis in the polling industry. Talk about that a little bit. We heard it. We had a panel here and in the Washington office of Duke with Neil Newhouse, a Duke grad who's a pollster, and he talked about the challenge of trying to reach people through cell phones and how he's having to boost that number and just all those challenges. How is that affecting the quality of the polls? And particularly, if you could talk a little bit about Brian mentioned the Eric Cantor race in Virginia, something that, yes, we were all surprised, but it seemed to me that was one where better reporting, if there were more reporters paying attention to that race, and better polling at the congressional district level, we might have had a sense that was happening.
Yeah, polling generally gets worse the further you go down the ballot, and it's also worse the lower turnout is. So in primaries where you have low turnout, it's not that uncommon to have an error of 10 or more points, right? I would hope, FiveThirtyEight launched in March 2008, so after the New Hampshire primary. I would hope that if we were covering it then, we would say, look, Obama's coronation is not assured here, that a 7-point lead in the polls in the primary is usually solid, but instead of winning the election 98% of the time, it's 80%, right? That Hillary actually still has a chance here. The polls have been off by that far in the primaries. You go to a congressional primary, it multiplies a lot more. There is some irony, I suppose, though, in that kind of the 3 elections where, in my view, there were the worst misses by the polls, meaning the Virginia primary where Cantor lost, the Virginia Senate race where Mark Warner nearly lost, and the Maryland governor's race were all in the little backyard of the Beltway, right? And they were missed nevertheless. I mean, you know, I know one kind of thread here is cutting back on local bureaus. I mean, you know, that is disturbing because, like I said, you know, we love when reporters are going out into the field and actually saying, here's what I see, right? You know, instead now, a lot of the journalism seems to be more and more obsessed with access, and they're getting the same information over and over again. But as far as the polling goes in general, almost all polls are now either surveying people on cell phones or conducting polls online, so that is a change since 4 years ago. But as Molly said, you know, the bigger crisis is that we now live in a world where we don't accept unsolicited solicitations from strangers, right? You know, if I get a call from an unknown number on my phone, then unless it's like I expect a restaurant to confirm a reservation or a flight to tell me that it's running late, or not a flight, the airline, you know, I will just let it go to voicemail. There is no way that you could reach me on, if you're a pollster, unless I picked it up by mistake or something. So that's becoming more problematic. Pollsters are hoping that the people who do respond to polls, which is somewhere between 2% and 10%, depending on the poll, will be representative of the 98% that don't, and that's worked reasonably well in some years, but not so well this year. It is challenging. And in terms of being prepared for the unpredictability of it, I mean, I do think this is why at FiveThirtyEight we emphasize we are making forecasts that have the uncertainty built in, and the uncertainty can be considerable, right? If you're making your 70-30 calls, you're supposed to get those wrong 30% of the time. Not only will you, but you're supposed to, or you've done something wrong. And I think people always used to think that was window dressing, even though there's like, oh, these guys just covering their butts just in case, right? I mean, that's part of the science and part of the research. And so, you know, in some ways I feel like if we're entering a environment where polling is more challenging, like intellectually it's way more interesting to us actually, because a story like, hey, just take the polling average and you'll be right 100% of the time, that's a really boring story, even though we seem to get more credit for that. But intellectually, it's more challenging in an environment where there are potential biases in the polls, where you have to look beyond polling. I mean, one thing about selection, you said it's the Obama election. This is kind of what the political science would have said it should be all along. You know, all along when people were looking at statistical models that don't use polling, that use the fundamentals, they said this should be a pretty good Republican year. Democrats almost always, the president's party almost always does poorly at midterms. Obama was less popular than the average president. You had elections in a lot of really red states, right? You know, the floor for Republicans should have been pretty high. How high the ceiling was, I don't think we knew. But, you know, when we talk about data-driven reporting, I mean, it's not just polling. It's also takes based on political scientists analysis of the ground game and advertising. It's reporting that's just data literate, where maybe you don't have a big sheen of data. It's just kind of informed by people who understand how to read a spreadsheet if they need to. And so, you know, I hope this campaign emphasizes that we do need a rich diet and a diverse diet of media coverage for when elections happen.
So I've got to point out there's a little irony here that Nate Silver is elusive to pollsters. I mean, that sure, if the pollsters can't reach you, I'm
not a likely voter either.
Are you? Did you not vote?
I haven't voted since 2008. And it's not so much for like this traditional, reporters should not have an opinion. It's partly that I get really busy around election days, and partly I figure that since I am
You know,
running numbers,
absentee ballots, Nate.
yeah. Plus, I live in New York, so we don't really. But no, I do feel like you should have a distance between the person who's conducting the experiment, so to speak, and the person who's in the experiment, which is different than saying, oh, I don't think the press should have any political opinions, right? People with no opinions about society, we have a name for them, and they're called sociopaths, right? Not something for journalists to aspire to necessarily. But I do think you should keep some arm's length distance if you're trying to survey polling that you're not somehow participating in this election yourself.
So now's a good point. Be happy to take some questions from the audience. If we've got a microphone there. How do you want to do this? Shall I just take it to people?
Yeah, down here it's too crowded, so I'll pass the mic up there. People should line up behind the mic up there.
In the on the second level here, there's a microphone. So if you just want to line up there, so great. All right, we'll take you first.
I'm very surprised that voter suppression hasn't come up as a topic so far. Do pollsters have to take into account voter suppression? You can get very accurate, very honest preference data, but if it becomes more and more difficult for that person to get to the poll, your data is off.
So what's your sense of that, Nate? This was the first election where we had many of the new laws about voter registration that Republicans wanted to push. Do you feel they suppressed the vote at all?
I mean, there is not people forget there is not a constitutional right to vote. That was one that our founding fathers perhaps overlooked, is to put a right to vote in in the Constitution. And so it can be curtailed in various ways. And I think that's a really bad thing for our democracy. As an empirical matter, how much do new voting laws affect turnout? The research from political science says perhaps not that much, in part because when you have efforts to curtail voting, people become aware of that, and that they may motivate them to make sure that their registration is current. One reason why Democrats have done so well in the early vote in 2008, 2012 is because African American voters in particular are very concerned about voter suppression, so they make sure they show up at the first opportunity to vote, and they do vote. The African American turnout actually overperformed the white turnout according to the election night exit polls in 2012. But still, like I said, it's one thing where you put your empirical hat on and one thing where you put your ethical hat on. And I'm surprised. Actually, one thing I'm surprised by is that when Democrats were in power in 2008, 2009, 2010, they should have made more efforts to entrench, make the right to vote more robust, right? Republicans are smart enough to know that, hey, we were elected this time around. That might not change. That might change in the future. So let's make it a little easier for us to get reelected next time. Democrats don't seem to do that as much.
Question down here. Right here.
Hi, my name's Emily. Thank you all so much for coming today. All three of you have mentioned increased data-driven journalism as part of a theme of today's discussion. And I was wondering, do you think that this increased data-based journalism has been accompanied by an increased understanding of statistics and statistical methodology, or just an increased use of numbers to inform a particular opinion of a news organization?
Good question. Molly?
That's a really good question. No, I am a journalist who knows how to do math, but that's a rare thing. And so I can recall times when people would come to me in the newsroom and say, how do you compute an average? It's that bad. And I'd have to show them. But at the same time, no, I do think the numbers are being used mostly for good, not for evil. I mean, Nate gets a lot of abuse from people who don't understand statistics. And that's why it's so good to have him and to have 538 around to tell people what actually is happening. We used to get a lot of complaints in the media that too much of political coverage was about polls, and we don't hear that so much anymore, I think in part because poll averages are such a gift, so that when I am writing a story and I want to characterize where a race stands, because even, if it's a sort of a feature story, sort of a narrative about the candidates, people want to know who's roughly ahead. And so I can say, according to the poll average or according to 538 or whatever, I don't have to say, well, there was this poll here and there was this poll here and there was this poll here. And so I think people feel that there's less of a glut of meaningless numbers that they can't necessarily rely upon. That can lead to an over-reliance right? And then when the polls are wrong, we're caught flat-footed. So I think we should be careful to be out there reporting on. In retrospect, I should have gone out and done a story on the Virginia Senate race. I live in Virginia. I could have done it on a weekend. But, I just wasn't convinced anyone would be interested in a race that seemed like a foregone conclusion. But I think the other thing is political science, which Nate mentioned. More and more political scientists are, directly critiquing the media, and I'm sure there are some in attendance, so I won't say anything negative about political scientists. But it is really helpful to have, again, that check on your assumptions and on your gut and on all the things that people think they know that turn out not to be true. Someone was just saying to me the other day, what we should have remembered all along in this election is that undecideds tend to break for the challenger. So, of course, all these incumbents who were stuck at 45% were going to end up going down. And I said, well, actually, there is political science on that question, and it's not true. Undecideds are just as likely, if not more so, to break for the incumbent. And this person was like really mad at me because they didn't think it could be true, because this has been an ironclad law of politics for as long as anyone can remember. But you can't argue with that data. Someone actually studied it, and that's what it turned out to be. So it's good to be listening to those voices.
Let's go up here.
Hey, this question could be for anyone. How do you think the absence of like a big prediction market like Intrade or something impacted this year's elections? Did it end up being like a sideshow in 2012, or do you think there was something more there?
Who wants to take
Well,
that?
there is a big prediction market called the stock market. If you looked at what happened to the market capitalization of stocks the morning after the election in 2012, stocks like oil and energy stocks, stocks anything having to do with healthcare, they moved very dramatically, where there were billions of dollars of shifts in market capitalization. That's much larger than people betting $1,000, which are what the magnitudes are often at Intrade. And there's also sites like Betfair where you can bet on this. But I don't know, Americans have a lot of hang-ups about gambling that I think are a little strange. Someone else, one of the guys at the March and Revolution blog, said that betting is a tax on bullshit, right? That's why sometimes when I've gotten into debates with people, I've kind of challenged them to a bet, because I used to play poker, and it's like, well, okay, this is how we know if you're actually bluffing or not, right? Do you actually believe what you're saying, right? And if you do, then okay, we'll bet on it. But it's a tax on bullshit, and I think it's good to have people who have the right incentives to make the right calls.
You just came up with a great idea for a cable news show.
Yeah.
If you're going to say something out of your mouth, you got to bet on it and prove that you actually believe it. It's a great idea.
Ooh, I like that idea.
Thank you for that, Nate.
That is great.
Don't give it to ABC.
Jeff Zucker on line one. Let's see, another question right here, Shelley.
Hi, I'm a master's student here in the Sanford School, and I have a statistics test on Monday. But my question is actually about the idea of, in this new era, that all politics are national, and the loss of political coverage at the state and local level. I'm from Georgia. There's a lot of interest in the Michelle Nunn and David Perdue race, but only towards the latter half of the election. And had that race not been going on, and the larger national story was not what it was, would I have been able to get access to information about my candidates in Georgia? And just wanted to get your ideas about it.
I think something that we saw in this election is that the Democratic candidates tried to localize the elections, but it was an election that fundamentally turned on national themes in the end. And the proof was sort of in the pudding there, right? That when candidates tried to turn these elections local, when Mark Pryor tried to make this all about, who's more in touch with Arkansas, me or this guy who's been here for 2 years, voters didn't care about that as much as they cared about, and maybe they're right. They're sending someone to the U.S. Senate whose voice is going to be on national issues, on federal issues, and what they decided they're concerned about is where that person stands on national concerns. I do think that as there is more, as our information sources are sort of homogenized, right, and people rely less on the local news and more on either national cable or on the internet, that more people are getting the same information instead of getting localized information. And there's all kinds of punditry about how the internet has made us less connected to our communities and to each other and to our neighborhoods, and I'm not going to take a side in that. But it does. But I think that people in this election were motivated by those national concerns much more than they were by the local concerns.
Can I try out? First of all, was this a lesser of two evils election? Did people go into the ballot box and just like, who do I hate less? It kind of felt like that for me, but that was just
I think that
in New
depends where
York.
you were. I think that there were a lot of candidates. I think the other, really determinative factor in this election is that Republicans didn't screw it up. Democrats thought they were really smart in the last 3 elections, and for being able to, make Republicans look crazy.
Making Todd Aiken and Christine, what's her name, the
but
witch.
it turned out
Right.
that when Republicans nominated candidates who didn't make those kind of gaffes, they took away most of the Democratic toolbox, and Democrats then couldn't compete with these candidates. So there were candidates like Cory Gardner in Colorado and Joni Ernst in Iowa and Tom Cotton in Arkansas who Republicans were really excited about. I don't think they thought they were voting for the lesser of two evils, even if they were also casting a vote against President Obama.
Right,
So,
right.
I mean, we always say that in campaigns, partly because there's so many negative ads that people are encouraged to feel negatively about the candidates. But it's not always the case.
I was going to try out a theory about what you're getting at, about the lack of local coverage and the diminished reporting. Might it be that because we live in this data-driven age where we're all looking at our web traffic all the time, that consumers actually have a much more direct impact on the content they're getting? So if you really care and all of your neighbors really care about the election, in theory, we're going to start producing lots of election coverage pretty directly as a result, as opposed to looking at the Nielsen ratings a week or a month later as they used to at local TV stations decades ago. It's possible that if we all, and I mean enough of us, a critical mass, were desperately Googling for information about our candidates locally, we'd all start churning out more content about it. And I know that might sound negative and it's problematic and all that. It also might be a good thing in some cases. Do you know what I'm getting at about?
So I guess what's troubling about that, as somebody who's concerned about the impact on democracy,
Right.
is if there aren't we don't know what we don't know.
Right.
If there aren't
Right.
reporters who
Right.
are looking into the candidates, if there aren't reporters who are questioning the candidates, we don't know what's there. And if the candidates are hiding behind campaign commercials and there are no availabilities, and the reporter who's assigned to cover the campaign is just doing a new blog post that begins, the Tillis campaign has a new ad today,
Right.
I worry about that.
Right.
One of
Those are the two sides of that coin. Yeah.
One other issue, too, with the instant feedback you can get now on how people are reading articles on your site is which is kind of the classic Coke versus Pepsi problem, where supposedly, if you have a taste test between Coke and Pepsi, and you take one sip, Pepsi wins because it's sweeter and you like the first hit on your palate more. But if you have a full can, then you like Coke more, right? So, what can you do to maximize page views now? Well, probably you'd say there's been an alien invasion, right? You would get a ton of page views for an enormous number of page views. You had a story on this for the first 5 minutes, half an hour, and then no one would ever come to your website again. So, we found that one mistake we were making early on in FiveThirtyEight when we launched in March was we were really, really too fixated on the day-to-day. And you believe me, you can go too far the other extreme where you're missing a story that you can cover well and your readers expect you to cover. But if you publish a mediocre lead-all story on Thursday morning, the world will go on and people will come back to your website when you publish a good story on Friday. And so it's important to make sure that you're investing enough time in stories that take more time to mature in development. That's harder now in a world where, and we said we're not going to look at the traffic numbers, but it's literally built into the CMSs, right? So you kind of can't avoid it. And that threw us for a loop at first.
What was your highest trafficked story this year?
Our highest traffic story
About
was
the elections.
Burritos.
Burritos. No, it was actually the story we did on Lionel Messi. So it's a diversity of things, right? The burrito story is really high. It's a story we did on the greatness of Lionel Messi, the soccer player. It's a story we did on
So
the
how far
long-term plight of the
down
middle
are the
class.
election posts? How far down are they? Pretty far down?
I think our live blog was like, if you count that as a post, was like our third or fourth highest story. But it's a really noisy signal now. Like we have a post that we did yesterday about how many executive orders each president has issued. It's a perfectly nice post, right? But for some reason, like the Facebook news algorithm picked this up as being a really amazing story. And so, randomly that's going to get hundreds of thousands, possibly over 1 million views, right? It's just really strange now. It's the other reason why this middle class story that we posted that did really well for us. Well, our economics writer, Ben Kesselman, writes on those themes a lot. So he's probably written, 4 or 5 stories that look at different aspects of this, but if you liked his middle class story, you should have liked those pieces too, and there can be a kind of, tenfold difference in traffic with basically the same story. It's not quite a randomized control trial, but And by the way, we as a website have more loyal customers, more traffic through the homepage than a lot of people. There are some sites who are purely relying on social media and SEO, and it's way more random in the short run than people realize.
Can I say one more thing about local? I just want to go back to the question of local reporting, because I started out as a local reporter in a paper that has pretty much been gutted since I left, unfortunately. And it is really important that candidates do have to answer local questions, even if those aren't the things that the election is going to turn on. So I don't mean to be glib about that. When I was a Nevada-based reporter during the 2008 election, I used to turn down interviews with Barack Obama because obviously this guy had no chance, and because I wasn't going to put him in my newspaper if he wasn't going to come to Nevada and talk to our voters. So I wasn't going to take a phone interview. Interesting decision in retrospect, but it does become boring when, as the Nevada reporter, it's your job to ask the national candidates what they think about Yucca Mountain, the proposed nuclear waste repository outside Las Vegas. And the candidates, you can practically see them rolling their eyes when they get asked about it in every Nevada interview, because even voters in Nevada are not basing their votes on it, even though it is the one issue that's unique to the state. Or ethanol in Iowa, the thing that candidates always get asked about when they go there. So fine. So the election's not going to turn on your position on Yucca Mountain, but it's really important that there's a local reporter asking that question of the candidates in that state. So when they do turn around and decide to put a nuclear repository in your state, you can't say that you weren't warned, right? They actually had to give you a sense of where they were on these decisions that are only going to matter to these finite populations in the course of getting elected.
All right, let's go up, David.
Hey, Bill, thanks. So I have a question that sort of goes to sort of the future of the news industry. You've each sort of talked about this. Molly, you talked about sort of how difficult it is for local reporting. Nate, you talked about the challenge to sort of reach voters in the new age. Bill, you mentioned sort of the changing economics and just how difficult it is right now to have reporters get people like Molly, sort of feet on the street talking to people. So the whole industry is changing. How do we, as citizens who want to be informed, we want good, accurate information, where do you see the news industry going? I mean, you got to re-envision your industry. Bill, you did this a number of years ago with PolitiFact, sort of trying to take a different approach. Where is the news media going? I mean, you can't just continue to sit back and talk about, oh, it's terrible, it's not like it was, we're not getting what we need. Where is it going to go? Do you see your employers trying to take different approaches, and where's it going to end up?
If you want, I'll start first, and I want to kind of put 2 thoughts in there about that. And the first is, I think there's real reason to be optimistic because we're thinking more about our audiences than we have in the past. I think Nate referred to a lot of journalists write articles for other journalists sometimes, and that cliche is there and it's true, but I think it's becoming less true, partly because of the data. Partly because of the traffic, which is a double-sided coin. Partly because of traffic, we're more responsive to our audiences, and that is a good thing in many ways. And I would just say, with regards to how are our newsrooms changing and how's the industry changing, I'll take CNN as an example. And I'm speaking just as one random employee at CNN, not anybody that really knows what's going on. But here's how I think CNN's changing. CNN's primarily, in the future, a digital product that happens to have a TV channel. Now, right now, obviously, the TV channel is where the money comes from for the most part. But it's increasingly going to be a digital operation with a digital newsroom gathering all the facts. And then there's a TV channel that talks about those facts and shares those facts and shows you the world changing in real time. And I say that because it's important to look at other cable news channels the same way. MSNBC and Fox we haven't even talked about them. They are vitally important to media and democracy because they are our there now are new versions of old partisan newspapers, right? The way 100 years ago, newspapers from the Republicans and the Democrats and all those parties back then existed in all the major cities. Well, now we have that again. We have Fox, we have MSNBC. They're very, very different. You can't really compare the two. There's lots of big differences between Fox and MSNBC. But they now exist in a way that is pretty clear. They're talk radio on TV. They're cable talk channels. They're not cable news. They're cable talk. And they're wonderful, and I love them, and I watch them both. We're going to have more of those in the future, right? We're going to have more point of view talk and news outlets in the future. We just need to make sure that we differentiate between those things, which are really valuable, wonderful things with points of view and opinion and commentary and ideology, and then the news over here, the facts that are gathered. And I say that because I think it's good to keep in mind cable news is going to be around in a big way in 2016. It's going to drive the discussion about Hillary Clinton and Rand Paul and all the other candidates that may or may not come along. And so we got to know what we're talking about when we talk about Fox News. Yeah, it's a news operation. It's also a political operation. MSNBC is a news operation. It is also, clearly defined by its liberal point of view. And so I say that because it's going to be even more explicit, I think, in the future, that we're going to have more of these point of view outlets, not just on TV, but on the web, but especially on TV. And I would differentiate between those and then the CNNs of the world, where especially on CNN.com, you've got a giant digital newsroom that I think is doubling down on just gathering information about politics without a point of view.
Yeah, I think it's important not to be too pessimistic about all this because, as you say, we have to adapt whether we like it or not, and just bemoaning the state of things is not helpful. When I left newspapers, which is more than 5 years ago now, it felt like a moment of sort of death in the industry, and now I think it feels much more like a moment of transition. That there's local news outlets are still really struggling and really haven't figured it out. But there are a lot of new digital outfits, places like FiveThirtyEight or like Fox or like all of the other, or Politico, where I used to work, that have cracked this nut of how you create a digital audience and monetize it and turn it into a sustainable business model for news publishing. And so I think it's a much more encouraging picture than it was a few years ago. There are obviously gaps in it. It would be great if we had more reporters in state houses. I used to cover the state legislature, and those are being hollowed out. And you do see some new online places being started that are doing that are, places like the Texas Tribune that are online only news organizations that are local, that are state-specific, and that are covering the state legislature and bringing some manpower back to that. So I think it's an evolution. I think it's a transition that is happening. I will go out to campaign events, and sometimes there won't be a local newspaper reporter there, but it won't be just me. It'll be someone from the Huffington Post and someone from a couple of other, national organizations that now have enough money that they can send people out in the field, so the eyes and ears are back, and that's really good. So there are green shoots, as we say, out there in the industry.
Look, whether it's a good time to be a journalist or not, I'm not sure. It's an interesting time, but I do think, on balance, it's been good for the consumer. One thing that we think about too is, look, we realize that people are going to read a lot of different news outlets, which is why we try and focus on the types of stories that we can cover best in the time frames that we're dealing with, instead of trying to be everything to every person. And you see this kind of in more competitive markets in general. I'm kind of a food geek, as I alluded to a couple times before, right? And it's like in New York, which is the most competitive restaurant in the world, every bar or restaurant has some kind of a theme or some type of a shtick. Like, not a cheesy, like, maritime theme or something like that, right? But it's not just a good restaurant. It has something different about it. And I think media's, for better or worse, becoming the same way. So at FiveThirtyEight, you're getting a lot of data and statistics and some cool graphics, right? Maybe that's your cup of tea, maybe not. Maybe we execute on it well, maybe we execute on it badly. But you know who we are and what we think we can do well in this very competitive landscape.
What you said is a really useful, the restaurant thing is a really useful analogy to point of view, right? That all outlets are going to have some point of view. It doesn't have to be ideological. It can be lots of different ways.
And I would add to that also that it is a great time to be an individual reporter, provided you have a job. It's hard to get a job, and it's a tough time for the industry. But as a reporter, I have, on the one hand, so much more input of information because I can read all these local newspapers online and I can see what's happening and track the campaigns from afar on a day-to-day basis. So when I do parachute into some state or town that I'm not from, I already have a lot of great context. And when I started out as a local newspaper reporter, the only people who could read my coverage were the people who were getting that product on their doorsteps. So people have access to information from so many more sources, and it's great as a reporter when you're able to disseminate your journalism so much more widely. People who didn't catch Brian's show on Sunday morning can see it on the web. People who may not get The Atlantic magazine or even go to theatlantic.com every day can come across one of my pieces because their friend shared it on Twitter or on Facebook, or they heard about it I had a story that Rush Limbaugh was talking about for a couple days. Maybe not the normal Atlantic.com audience, but once a piece of content is out there, anyone has access to it, and it can reach all kinds of communities that you might not have been expecting to reach with your journalism.
Now, Thanksgiving, we just need to make sure we remind our crazy uncle or our crazy aunt, if they love MSNBC or they love Fox, they need to watch both, right? They need to watch all of them.
Can't
they
they
need
just
to
watch
read.
CNN?
They need. They should watch CNN as well. But I think I appreciate that, by the way. They should read all of it and watch all of it. I do think we continue to see this year, and the Pew Research backs it up, a continued trend of folks either trusting one side or the other. And that's what I'm not optimistic about. To the original question, that's what I'm somewhat still pessimistic about.
We got time for one more question. Phil? You bet.
Just before we close, one question about the future. Everything's been about the past so far, or the present and past. As soon as it became apparent which way the elections were going to go, which is quite a while back, we began to read all the reports, statements either by Democratic operatives or by Democratic-oriented news organizations already discounting it and saying, well, the loss this year will be a gain for the president, or will be a gain in 2016. And it was based almost entirely, as far as I can tell, on straight-line extrapolations of demographic trends, as if what you saw before would continue unbroken, not revert to form. And so those were young people and Latino voters principally, more than others, but others as well. But I took a look at the actual numbers for 2008, 2012, 2016 for those two groups. And reading what I read, I mean, those are presidential years, midterm years, they're good economic years and bad economic years. But reading those numbers, it seems to me you can make a pretty good argument that the Democrats who say that are deluding themselves about 2016. And I'm just curious as to what lessons you learned from your coverage this year. Thank you.
I mean, yeah, I do think that Democrats are fooling themselves to some extent. If you actually, first of all, if you model out how much change this makes, if you assume things are static, you say, well, the same vote shares of each demographic group, each demographics will vote for the same parties, but the population will change. It only amounts to like an extra point or so for Democrats every 4 years, right? Which is something. Some elections are certainly won and lost at the margin, but it's not as dramatic as people might think. But it's a point you made before where parties should adapt to their circumstances. This year, where the Republicans nominated a series of candidates who were, if not, Lincoln Chafee-style moderates by any means at all. They were conservative Republicans, but they were within the mainstream of the American electorate. That's a big change from 2010 and 2012, and that shows the party adopting to the circumstances. Kind of conversely, when parties are in power for a long time, they can ironically kind of lose touch with voters. Obama gave Democratic voters no reason to vote for him apart from, more Republicans in power would be bad. And so, yeah, people tend to, the bigger problem is that people always assume the trend that existed in the last election or two will persist indefinitely. We do a lot of old research on old polls like LexisNexis, right? You can see stories from 1990 where Republicans said, unless there's a high turnout, we're screwed. The conventional wisdom in 1990 was that Republicans need a high turnout to turn out their marginal voters. You can go back further. It was 1936 where I think Maine and Vermont were the only states to vote Republican. Every other state went Democratic. So these things do change, and a lot of political bar fights could be settled by the guy who says, instead of looking at 4 years of data, let's look at 40. The person looking at the longer-term trend is almost always going to have a better answer.
Well, the political scientists will tell you that the best single predictor of how someone's going to vote is how they voted in the past. So it is not insane to extrapolate outwards from trends and say, you know, if there are this many people who tend to vote for Democrats and this many people who tend to vote for Republicans, very few of them are going to switch. That's why we talk about, you know, swing voters being sort of a myth. But obviously, different things happen in different elections, and we need to be prepared for, you know, for unexpected issues to come on the agenda and for people to react to those in different ways, and for parties' messages to change. I think that's a really important point. Politics is a marketplace, and in a marketplace, you're going to have an equilibrium achieved by people battling for the same market share. And so when Republicans realize they're getting killed with women voters who think that women ought to be barefoot and pregnant, they propose having birth control be over the counter, and that really changes things when people see, oh, you're not this caricature of a Republican who thinks that, you know, rock and roll's communism and bike lanes are a UN plot. So there's flexibility, you know, on the candidates. There's flexibility in the electorate, and to the point about 2016 specifically, I think this is a big warning sign for Democrats. We have yet to see an election in which the Obama coalition is activated for a candidate who's not Obama. It hasn't happened, and so is a candidate going to be able to do it in the future? We don't know. And to assume that Democrats, I think the assumption for Democrats has been that the Obama coalition is their new floor. Right? That any future candidate is going to get that same share of minority vote and turnout, plus maybe do better with white people. It may be the opposite. It may be that that's the ceiling, that future candidates, like we saw in this election, a lot of the Democratic candidates, incumbents in red states, people who've won before in red states, thought, well, I'll have all those people that Obama started turning out. I'll get that share of the minority electorate. And then I'll do better with white people because I'm not Obama. And the opposite happened. They did worse. So I think Democrats really have, the smart Democrats are not buying their own spin. The smart Democrats are taking a hard look at where things stand and how they can adapt.
This has been a really interesting discussion, and I want to thank the panel. I think our big legacy today will be this great idea for a new TV show. Will you get Jeff Zucker on the phone, and let's talk about this.
I also hope that since we were recording this, we can go back in 2 years and listen to all of our guesses and predictions and comments and see how smart or foolish they sound.
Exactly.
The beauty of the videotape.
So I want to thank Brian and Molly and Nate. I especially want to thank Phil and Nancy and Jennifer for your support of this. This is just a wonderful event, and I hope that you all have enjoyed it as much as we have. Thank you very much.